Royal Lodge on the Windsor estate. It's one of the most luxurious and secret royal homes.
I think it's one of the grandest, really, of royal residences.
Royal Lodge has been an important home at the heart of the monarchy for 2 centuries.
But today, Prince Andrew is holed up in the secluded mansion after being disgraced and stripped of his royal titles.
I think Andrew's life is really miserable at the moment.
Now he's locked in an extraordinary battle with his brother King Charles over his right to continue living there.
You have someone who has brought the royal family into scandal in this huge property. It looks terrible. It's been dubbed the Siege of Royal Lodge.
But in happier times, Royal Lodge was where the late Queen Elizabeth enjoyed an idyllic childhood.
It's one of the happy places for Lilibet all through her life.
It's where the Queen Mum hosted some of her most legendary parties.
It's like the stories I think of her doing congas through Royal Lodge, through the windows, out of the saloon, onto the ground and then back again.
And her great-granddaughters had some wild times there too.
So Beatrice gets the sword from the wall and she swings it down to knight James Blunt, but behind her was Ed Sheeran, and she caught him on the face.
This magnificent home is prime royal real estate, a 30-room mansion on nearly 100 acres. And over the years, it's been at the centre of some very big stories.
The police had to, poke in the bushes and in the woodland to make sure there was no paparazzi, there was no photographers hiding in there.
Now, as Royal Lodge hits the headlines again, we reveal its secrets, past and present, and look at what may lie ahead as Charles and Andrew battle it out over the future of this much-loved royal home. Over the past year, Royal Lodge has been at the centre of a media storm. Its current occupant, Prince Andrew, the disgraced Duke of York, is at loggerheads with his older brother, the King, over the £30 million mansion.
The palace never confirm rumours, but it is so strongly rumoured, and it hasn't been denied, that King Charles would like his brother to move out of Royal Lodge.
The reason given by those close to the King is that he doesn't think it's appropriate for a disgraced member of the royal family to live in such luxury.
But Prince Andrew doesn't want to leave his home of 20 years.
He loves the stature that it gives him. He doesn't have anything else. He doesn't have any of his royal titles. He doesn't have any of his military titles. He's not a working royal. It's the last bit of status that he can hold on to is staying within Royal Lodge, and he will hang on to that tooth and nail.
And so we have what people are describing as a siege. Charles would like his brother to move out. Andrew does not want to leave.
So he's sticking his heels in. The King is adamant that he has to go. This story is not going to end happily.
Despite all the headlines, not a lot is known about the much-loved royal retreat that lies hidden behind high fences and secure woodlands. So where exactly is Royal Lodge? And what is it like behind the rose-pink entrance?
Royal Lodge is about 3 miles from Windsor Castle itself on the estate, and it's a rather fabulous country mansion. I've always thought it was one of the most imposing and grand of the royal residences.
The Grade 2 listed Royal Lodge has 30 rooms, including 7 bedrooms spread over the top 2 floors. The ground floor includes a kitchen, library, conservatory and a study. But there's one room that really makes the house feel like a royal residence. The 200-year-old drawing room or grand saloon.
The outstanding room in Royal Lodge, right at the heart of it, is sometimes called a grand saloon. But it's a Gothic withdrawing room and quite a grand space of pointed arches marching around the walls. And it's an attempt, in a way, to evoke the Middle Ages, which is very popular during the 1820s.
It is a remnant of the Georgian Regency splendour that was invested here in the 19th century. There are crystal chandeliers, huge French windows, elaborate mouldings, but there's also been a great amount of history that has happened here over the centuries.
If the walls of the drawing room in Royal Lodge could talk, what stories it would tell us.
So many amazing things happened in that grand saloon
It played a pivotal role for the royal family during the abdication crisis. Princess Margaret had her engagement photos there. Princess Eugenie had wedding celebrations there. It has been at the heart of some of the big royal dramas and scandals since George IV.
Although Royal Lodge has played a big part in royal life and is just 25 miles from London, its location in the middle of Windsor Great Park makes it feel like a remote countryside retreat.
Windsor Great Park is one of the most magnificent and wonderful landscapes in the country. This great estate of 5,000 acres with its undulations and its avenues and its statues.
It's away from those prying eyes, it's surrounded by trees, has a lovely sort of garden as well within it, and it also blends seamlessly into that larger landscape.
The grounds stretch to 98 acres and include a child-sized play cottage, 8 staff houses and a private chapel, which was originally built in the 1820s. The Chapel of All Saints has remained a royal favourite ever since.
I think for people like the late Queen Mother, like the late Queen Elizabeth, to go somewhere like the Chapel of All Saints, or to be in a sort of relatively small, by their standards, house like Royal Lodge, it's almost like a taste of reality, a taste of privacy.
Because it's so private, Royal Lodge allows the royal family to live a relatively normal life out of the spotlight.
You can feel as if you're completely on your own and you can have complete privacy.
In good times, that's made it a place where they can grow up away from the public's gaze as a happy and contented family. But in bad times, that privacy has meant that Royal Lodge is where some of the royal family's most unpopular members have hidden themselves from public criticism.
Today, Royal Lodge is Prince Andrew's hideaway, where the disgraced Duke spends most of his time after stepping back from royal duties in 2019.
Andrew is a bit of a recluse now. He apparently spends a great deal of his time either playing video games or, most lately, watching aircraft take off and land. I think he projects it onto a great big screen or onto the wall anyway, and tunes into one of these apps or whatever, where you can watch live coverage of, well, it is a plane spotter, really. That's what he is. He's a plane spotter.
It's definitely a far cry from his days as a helicopter pilot. I mean, it's clear that his love for that is still there, but now he's, stripped of all his military titles and he's kind of reduced to watching planes landing on an app that's projected on the walls of Royal Lodge.
But Andrew isn't completely alone at Royal Lodge. Despite having been divorced for nearly 30 years, his ex-wife Sarah Ferguson lives there too.
It's one of the most bizarre relationships, isn't it, really, Andrew and Fergie? But I kind of admire them for it. They are, by Sarah's own description, the bestest friends in the world, the happiest divorced couple.
They have separate wings, even, of Royal Lodge. They can come and go and not see each other. Although they do see each other, they spend a lot of time together. It's reported that they have afternoon tea together every day. I don't think they have it every day, but they certainly make arrangements to have supper with each other. I think they have found a really good symbiosis.
But while Prince Andrew might be the current royal hiding away behind the curtains of Royal Lodge, he certainly isn't the first.
It's a very secretive place, and I think the royal family like it that way.
So which other royals have used the sprawling private retreat to escape from prying eyes? Buckingham Palace, Brighton Pavilion, Windsor Castle. These iconic buildings became the splendid monuments to the majesty of the British monarchy we know today, thanks to one extravagant ruler, Queen Victoria's uncle, King George IV.
Much of the trappings of the modern monarchy are down to George IV, but it turns out that the place he loved most was Royal Lodge.
Today, Royal Lodge is one of the grandest family homes in the royal property portfolio. But this impressive 30-room mansion bears no resemblance to the small cottage that George came across in the early 1800s when he was looking for a country retreat in Windsor Great Park.
There was a house on the position of Royal Lodge dating back to the 1660s, but it was a very small house. In fact, it was the Deputy Ranger's property. It is a 2-storey and it's got 3 reception rooms and only 2 bedrooms. But George wants it and he wants to extend it.
Even though this was only going to be his country retreat, George had lavish tastes and luxurious expectations.
And he brings in John Nash to be the person to revive the house to the standards that George IV feels are befitting of his status.
Nash created Brighton Pavilion in 1815. He created Regent Street, really, by driving a new avenue through London. Regent's Park at the top, it's Nash all over again. Buckingham Palace, Marble Arch, Nash.
At Royal Lodge, he kept very little of the original building, adding dozens of rooms and a very fashionable thatched roof.
Nash tries to merge 2 styles, one for the faux rustic retreat and one with the demented extravagance of George IV.
George called his new home a cottage, but once inside, it was more like a palace.
The 60-foot facade becomes 170 foot. There's a large conservatory, a giant eating room with 17 bedrooms and 12 reception rooms. This is not a cottage.
All of these changes added up to a gargantuan bill.
He was known for fulfilling your expectations and exceeding your budget, so you get the house of your dream and the invoice of your nightmares.
Nash had originally estimated the work would cost less than £3,000.
Final bills came in at around £30,000. I mean, completely preposterous.
George IV was well known for his over-the-top taste in interiors, and he spent another £17,000 of public money furnishing Royal Lodge, about £1.3 million today. In 1824, the house became known as the Royal Lodge for the first time. And throughout his reign, the king spent more and more of his time there.
After a life on the big stage and much cavorting with mistresses and marvellous meals and banquets, I think that this is a place where he can retire because he's sick and old, and Royal Lodge is like a marvellous haven for him.
And the only thing he found real solace in was going to see his menagerie. Now, that blows my mind that in Windsor they have a small menagerie, a private zoo for the king.
He had an elephant which he used to keep in the horse stables, and used to really love the idea when he was entertaining to take people down to the stables to see this incredible elephant. He was also then given 2 ostriches as well from the Prince of Sakatu, but unfortunately one of them didn't last very long. They decided to cook it and carve it up for dinner.
By far and away, his favourite pet was a giraffe that, when it was a little giraffe, had to be strapped to the back of a very sturdy camel that carried it 6 weeks on a journey towards transport to England. George IV loved this. He would regularly go to visit it with his mistress.
He's really got his own African safari going on in Windsor Great Park.
He just really loved the idea of just being able to go down, see these animals. And yeah, it was just like his little place of heaven, I suppose.
When George died in 1830, the menagerie was shut down and the animals sent to London Zoo. For nearly 15 years, Royal Lodge had been at the very heart of the monarchy. But when George's successor, his brother William IV, came to look at the property, he was in for a shock.
It turns out that John Nash had just put lipstick on the gorilla of Royal Lodge, because behind the fine joinery, the pictures, the tapestries, the carpets, there was a building riddled with dry rot. It was crumbling.
Royal Lodge was in such bad condition, there was no saving it. George IV's beloved country retreat was torn to the ground. Only the cast-iron conservatory and the newly added grand drawing room were left standing.
There's nothing left of the original early house there. It's been rebuilt and demolished and then remodelled all over again. The building has changed material, changed colour, changed the interiors. Everything about it has changed.
It was Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, who rescued Royal Lodge from the ruins. He added several new rooms and divided the large drawing room into 3.
Because this was not going to be a pleasure house as such anymore. It was to be a tutorial house, a school, essentially, for their son, Alfred.
So for 2 years, he's sent 3 miles away from Windsor Castle with tutors to be schooled in whatever were the appropriate ways of kingship that the rather strict Prince Albert had.
I suppose in a way it's a bit like Prince Philip sending Charles off to Gordonston. You know, the cold baths, the rigorous exercising.
Alfred left Royal Lodge when he was 14 years old to join the Navy. It would be many years before Royal Lodge was back in royal favour again.
Over the next 70 years, Royal Lodge comes together in fits and starts. Different members of the royal household are given it as their grace and favour accommodation. They make some changes. Queen Victoria invests a little bit more in it. But it's really in the early 1930s that we see Royal Lodge emerge into a royal residence once again.
This was the moment when Royal Lodge rose in importance once more as the weekend home of a new generation of royals.
In 1931, the Duke and Duchess of York, who later became the Queen Mother and King George VI, were given Royal Lodge.
The Royal Lodge is the first time that this young family of Elizabeth, George, then Princess Elizabeth, then aged 5, and Princess Margaret, suddenly they can create a family home.
But the peace of this new family home wouldn't last for long. The family didn't know it, but just a few years later, Royal Lodge would be at the heart of a crisis and the setting for one of the most dramatic evenings in royal history. The Queen Mother loved Royal Lodge and lived there for 70 years.
What luck to have a day. It's really what God said.
It's a day in a million.
It is.
But the Royal Lodge she proudly showed off on her 90th birthday was a far cry from the house she and her husband, the future King George VI, inherited in 1931. Back then they were just Bertie and Elizabeth, the Duke and Duchess of York.
When the Duke and Duchess came across Royal Lodge, they fell in love with it straight away, even though it was very dilapidated at that stage. It hadn't been used as a royal residence for the best part of 100 years. Various people had been living in it, and clearly they hadn't really looked after it. So it was a big project to take on.
They spend £5,000, which is the equivalent of £300,000 today, of their own money renovating it. The economy was in a dire strait. I mean, this is the Depression. There's just no way that the government's going to pay for renovating the house.
They spent their money partly on demolitions, getting rid of the old, no doubt rusty conservatory, and removing the partitions which had disfigured the Gothic room. And so they revealed some of the grand spaces again, but they also built 2 wings. This is really what gives us the impression of Royal Lodge we see today.
Elizabeth was in charge of the interior decoration.
She really created it into a country house style. She had pastel blues, pastel pinks. It's famously that was what the Queen Mother would wear. So I think that if we're trying to imagine what Royal Lodge would have looked like in the 1930s, we have to look at one of the Queen Mother's outfits from the 1980s and say it would have been that, but on the walls of a house.
Most famously, Elizabeth has the entire outside of the house painted rose pink.
Frankly, it's be like a giant marshmallow.
It wasn't just the house that needed work. The 98-acre garden was overgrown and neglected.
It was a bit of a wild place, you might say.
King George VI, when he was Duke of York, he just spent his entire free moments digging the garden and creating the garden. And they kind of created it together, although I don't think that the Queen Mother actually did a lot of digging. But she was very good at, at flowers and plants.
It was great fun to do, The King made this garden, you see, really. I mean, he did all the work.
But late Queen Mother, she would be able to tell you stories about every single shrub and tree that was in that garden.
They used to ask all sorts of people to help them. I think any visitors who came down to Royal Lodge suddenly found themselves out in the garden, with a scythe or something or a pair of shears.
Kind people did do a little digging and snipping and all that sort of thing. Yes, they were all very helpful.
There was a guardsman, actually, once who was persuaded to join in, and he had a new bearskin, and he wanted to sort of, like a pair of shoes, sort of wear it in a bit. And it was a very hot day, so he stripped down to the waist and apparently had some shorts on, obviously some shoes or boots, and his bearskin. And the Duchess remarked afterwards that he was in full dress, but only down to his eyebrows.
Royal Lodge became the family's weekend retreat. Its vast, secure grounds allowed Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret to have an unusually carefree childhood.
Well, I think Margaret and Elizabeth did have quite a normal life there because it was free of the restrictions of a royal palace. So they could run into their parents' room in the morning and sort of bounce on the bed.
They had lots and lots of room to play, huge gardens to play in. They had rocking horses, lots and lots of toys.
A swimming pool was specially dug out for the young princesses once they were a little older and they, learned how to swim.
It was the country and they could do things in the garden and they learned to ride. It was endless fun.
But we have to always remember this really wasn't part of how we understand normal life. They were living in a massive mansion with a retinue of servants. It was still a very privileged existence.
Royal Lodge to me, for Elizabeth and Margaret, is like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It looks like the inside of a pastel chocolate. It's got woodlands and waterfalls, and they've even got their own private swimming pool. What a luxury.
Princess Elizabeth even had a play cottage at Royal Lodge, a spectacularly generous gift from the people of Wales for the future Queen's 6th birthday.
Bwthyn Bach, or the Little House as it was basically a Welsh thatched playhouse.
This tiny cottage was just beautiful. I say tiny, but I mean, it wasn't really. As a grown adult, if you just stoop down a bit, you can go in, and it's got 4 rooms, it's got a landing, it's got a working kitchen, hot and cold water.
We know that the young princesses often spend many happy hours trying to cook and bake, though we don't know how edible some of those confections were.
The princesses may not have kept an elephant in the stables like George IV, but there were a lot of animals at Royal Lodge.
They had so many pets, they had so many dogs, and it was also where they acquired their first corgi, a dog named Dookie.
The corgis were really the house pets, and the love affair began then and lasted till after the Queen's death.
There was really a full circle moment, actually, with the Queen's corgis. The last 2 that she had, we saw them sort of almost front and centre at her funeral. And those 2 dogs went home with Prince Andrew to Royal Lodge.
With their expansive garden, lovely house and multiple pets, the Yorks' life in the lodge was idyllic. But unfortunately, it wouldn't last.
Royal Lodge is the setting for the beginning of a crisis that will turn the country upside down. It's April 1936. A new king is on the throne. Edward VIII has been on the throne since January, and Edward VIII is the older brother of Bertie.
Edward VIII and his brother, the Duke of York, had been great friends, in fact. But their tensions begin when Edward VIII becomes king. This all comes to a head at Royal Lodge when Edward drives over with a brand new American car that he wants to show off to his younger brother.
And he brings along with him his American mistress, Wallis Simpson.
Wallis steps out of the car, comes into the house, and she immediately causes a opprobrium.
She draws Edward to the window and she starts saying, this is how the view could be improved. Take down some trees, take down a bit of that hill. Now, Bertie and Elizabeth hear this, and they are so upset.
Royal Lodge is their home, and to have a guest come in and decide that all the hard work that the Duke and Duchess have done in landscaping their wonderful, beautiful gardens is not worthy of her taste. I mean, you can understand why the Duchess of York in particular would think this was insulting.
The relationship with Wallis and Elizabeth started frosty at Royal Lodge, and it became ice cold. The 2 absolutely reviled each other.
8 months later, in December 1936, things got much worse, and Royal Lodge would be the stage where the drama played out.
Edward announces that he has every intention of marrying the twice-divorced Wallis Simpson.
Edward was in love with Wallis. He would have no one else. But as a twice-divorced woman, she was not suitable to be queen.
The king is supreme governor of the Church of England, which takes a very, very dim view of divorce.
He has a clear choice in front of him, but what does he choose?
If the king insisted on marrying her, the only option available was abdication. So it was either Wallis or the throne.
Edward also had a country house in Windsor Great Park and shut himself away there to make his choice, love or duty.
And at Royal Lodge, it is the most stressful possible moment when everything could change on the decision of Edward. His yes or no changes their lives forever.
If he abdicates, suddenly they're the King Emperor and the Queen Empress with vast constitutional responsibilities that they're not really ready for. And yet they're powerless in this decision, waiting.
On Monday, December the 7th, Edward asked his younger brother to come to his home and told him he'd reached his decision.
And Edward tells Bertie that he is going to abdicate the throne and Bertie will now be king.
Bertie rushes back to Royal Lodge and blurts this momentous news out to his wife. He's despairing and despondent because the reality is now dawning on both Bertie and Elizabeth that their lives will be changed forever.
I mean, the amount of strain on this family, there'd been the brother who'd been born to it and trained for it. Suddenly he was chucking it all in after a few months. And there they were, the hand of destiny, that day at Royal Lodge, pointed at them.
And it was at Royal Lodge that 4 days later, the royal family gathered to say goodbye to Edward.
Before Edward VIII made the broadcast to the country to tell them that he would leave the throne, there was a family dinner at Royal Lodge.
And of course, the atmosphere is almost surreal. Their mother, Queen Mary, is sitting tight-lipped, not showing any emotion. One of the brothers is weeping inconsolably.
So they have a very, very tense dinner, at which I think actually Edward VIII is quite jovial. And somebody says, oh, this is the man we're losing, because he's quite jolly.
And Prince Edward, as he now is, leaves the dining table at Royal Lodge to go across to Windsor to record his message on radio to the nation. That sets the seal, makes it public, that he's no longer king.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as king and emperor. And now we all have a new king.
So he then returns to Royal Lodge after the speech. His brother is now king. He's demoted.
Edward kisses the hand of his younger brother, the new king, and says, "Thank you, sir, for all your kindness to me." And when George protests, Edward says, "It's all right, old man. I must step off with the right foot from the start."
So suddenly, the brother who's played second fiddle his whole life is suddenly first fiddle.
And just as suddenly, Royal Lodge was the country home of a king once again.
When George VI became king, they certainly treasured Royal Lodge even more than ever, because that was their escape. They really thought that this was their home.
They really wanted to just be normal at the Royal Lodge. So if they wanted coal for the fire, King George would just go out, he would go and get the coal and bring it in for the fire. So they really just wanted to have this sort of everyday life, which was away from all that sort of ceremony that comes with being a king or a queen.
But it wasn't long before their quiet life at Royal Lodge was turned upside down once more.
During World War II, the royal family, Elizabeth and Margaret and their parents, lived at Windsor Castle, and the King and Queen went back and forth to Buckingham Palace. But they did return to Royal Lodge when it was safe. There were picnics, they used a swimming pool, and as Elizabeth later wrote, it was a few moments of true peace.
Changes are made to Royal Lodge as they were made to many prominent buildings in the war years. The pink goes, it makes it far too much of a visible target, it's repainted grey, and they reinforce the basement in case of a bombing raid.
It was very much a target for enemy bombers. I mean, hundreds of bombs, V1 bombs, were actually dropped in the grounds of Windsor Great Park.
In the summer of 1944, one of these bombs came dangerously close to the heirs to the throne.
Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret were part of a Girl Guide group set up by their mother to give them a sort of wider variety of acquaintances and friends. And they were in Windsor Park toasting sausages over a fire with other members of the troop when the bombs started falling. One of the leaders threw herself over the princesses. Some of the other girls were sheltered by other leaders, but they all came very close to being killed in this V1 attack on Windsor Park.
Fortunately, all the Girl Guides escaped injury, but Royal Lodge wasn't so lucky.
The house got a bit rattled with bombs and things.
Yes.
The front bit fell out, which was very awkward.
So
That had to be rebuilt.
Royal Lodge itself avoided a direct hit, but the gatekeeper's cottage was bombed and the gatekeeper and his wife were killed.
After the war, Royal Lodge was repaired and its cottages rebuilt. Soon the house glowed rose pink again.
But life has changed for the royal family, as indeed it has for the country. And they can never really quite go back to how it was in the past.
The girls, they were growing up. Elizabeth was in love with Prince Philip and thinking ahead to their marriage together. And the king, his health really had been wrecked by the war, the strain, the stress. And the Bertie who'd organised the gardens, organised the house, that was a different man.
Royal Lodge's time as a tranquil family home was coming to an end. In just a few years, it would only be the Queen Mother and her youngest daughter Margaret living there. But this regal residence's time in the spotlight wasn't over. Princess Margaret's love affairs were about to become front-page news.
Royal Lodge was surrounded with photographers.
The police had to, poke in the bushes and in the woodland to make sure there was no paparazzi, there was no photographers hiding in there trying to capture the money shot.
The press, if they're onto a story, they're not going to leave it alone. And this was a very, very big story indeed.
Throughout World War II, Royal Lodge remained a sanctuary for the royal family. But the strain of leading the country through the conflict took its toll on King George VI, and he died just a few years later.
You can't overestimate the shock it was for Queen Elizabeth to find herself Queen Mother. I mean, she thought she was going to be Queen Consort for many years to come, and to be widowed so early on, in 1952, was devastating for her.
And as the Queen Mother's world turned upside down, Royal Lodge remained her refuge.
She's not just lost the husband she adores. Her role in the family and in the country has changed. She's no longer expected to live in several of the homes that she lived in before, including Buckingham Palace. There is a complete reconfiguration of Elizabeth's personal and public life after her husband's death.
And after the huge ordeal of the state funeral for George VI, she goes straight back to the Royal Lodge to try and put the pieces of her life back together.
The Queen Mum didn't live alone at Royal Lodge after her husband's death. It was still her younger daughter, Princess Margaret's weekend home.
Princess Margaret was very close to George VI. Her father's death was a terrible blow, and I suppose she comforts herself in the arms of her father's favourite equerry, Peter Townsend.
Peter Townsend was seen as not a suitable person for Princess Margaret to marry for a variety of reasons. I mean, he was older than her, he was divorced, he had worked for her father. It was just a litany of reasons why he was not a suitable suitor.
He's divorced, and she's the sister of the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, so it's kind of shades of the abdication crisis again.
Royal Lodge helped keep their love affair top secret.
The fact that Margaret could be at Royal Lodge and meet up with him went very much under the radar.
It's quite large grounds, it's quite sort of secret and sequestered. You can come and go without being seen.
But Royal Lodge couldn't shelter the couple forever. At the new Queen's coronation in June 1953, reporters spotted Margaret and Townsend together. Their secret was out, and it was a huge scandal.
Royal Lodge was surrounded with photographers, and they were in every nook and cranny. The police protection officers were so vigilant that they even went round poking sticks into bushes in case they could find anyone hidden away there. This was a very, very big story indeed.
After Princess Margaret gave in to pressure and ended her relationship with Townsend, Royal Lodge became a different kind of sanctuary, a place to party away her heartbreak.
I mean, Princess Margaret was the it girl of her generation.
She was absolutely beautiful, and she was always being photographed at nightclubs and with various sort of celebrities of the day.
Princess Margaret was fun and fabulous, and certainly brought a lot of the frivolity and frolics to Royal Lodge.
In 1958, a society photographer named Anthony Armstrong-Jones began to join these weekend parties.
Anthony Armstrong-Jones was a commoner, the charming, dashing young man who was a bit of a rogue. And he charmed not just Princess Margaret, but more importantly, the Queen Mum. And she did everything in her power to ensure that Royal Lodge was available for the rendezvous that the young lovers wanted.
Royal Lodge afforded them the privacy to be able to get to know each other without too much scrutiny, without people really realising.
They had to keep it so secret. He was a photographer, and that was, almost as bad as being divorced.
And the excuse was that he was building an aviary for the Queen Mum in the grounds of Royal Lodge. So when their engagement was finally announced, even the staff at Royal Lodge were really taken aback because they hadn't really appreciated the royal romance that had been taking place under their noses.
Princess Margaret's engagement to Anthony Armstrong-Jones was a huge shock to everybody around them, so much so that when Princess Margaret announced, "I'm engaged," people said, "To who?"
And Royal Lodge was where they chose to introduce Margaret's fiancé to the public.
Margaret was, hugely significant cultural figure. People forget in the 1950s because it was a smaller royal family, and here was this great society beauty, and people knew that she couldn't marry the man she'd wanted to marry. So it's very significant that they were unveiled as a couple at Royal Lodge.
Princess Margaret married Anthony Armstrong-Jones in May 1960, but the social whirl of weekends at Royal Lodge continued.
The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret had many differences in their personality, but both of them enjoyed a party. And under the Queen Mother, Royal Lodge was very much a social hub.
Well, a weekend at Royal Lodge would have been sumptuous. It was like stepping back in time. The Queen Mother was the most wonderful hostess.
She would make sure to have a good seating chart at the dinner table so that there would be a good mix of people talking to one another.
She liked to have fun, and she wanted all her guests to have as much fun as she was having. And she was very clever about who she invited.
And she also liked to set out gifts depending on which guests were coming. So she and her staff kept a list of the different presents that had been given by different friends. And depending on who was coming to stay, they would make sure to put their gift out on the table so it looked as if it was always in a cherished spot.
The Queen Mother's guest list was a who's who of her favourite entertainers.
She invited a lot of people from the arts, actually. She loved Ted Hughes, the poet. I mean, he was a really good friend. And I think he would do all sorts of recitals there.
Any plays that might be on in the West End, if there was someone the Queen Mother knew or wanted to know, they would be invited.
And Noel Coward was another one. That he would sit at the piano and play and sing.
You might find the Queen Mother sitting at the piano with Noel Coward singing one of his songs. Don't Let's Be Beastly to the Germans was a favourite. But she also enjoyed a rousing sing-along of She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain.
Edward Fox was one of those actors who was invited down there, and I think he recited some poetry for her, so everyone would get up and do a turn.
But then she would hope very much that they would get up and have a dance, because that's what she liked to do.
The Queen Mother loved dancing, even in her old age.
Often she used to stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning, and this is when she was well into her 80s and 90s. I mean, she had this extraordinary energy, and music made her want to dance.
She could be seen burling around the room, glittering from head to toe, always dressed to the nines, leading the dancing throughout the night.
I think there's stories, I think, of her doing congas through Royal Lodge, through the windows, out of the saloon, onto the ground, and then back again.
And she would sort of wave her hands in the air and lead the conga line all around the house. And of course, it's such a stupid game that everyone became hysterical.
It sounds amazing. Who wouldn't want to go for a party at Royal Lodge with the Queen Mother?
All the Queen Mother's guests were expected to join in the fun.
And there are all sorts of stories of her guests, some of them, quite elderly and some of them quite incapacitated.
Lord Hailsham, who had arrived at Royal Lodge on 2 walking sticks, threw the sticks away and danced a reel with her at the lodge.
That's what Royal Lodge represented to her, a place where she could entertain and let her hair down.
Often, the Queen Mother's weekend parties would include a visit to one of the local racecourses.
She adored her racing, and she had house parties around all the big race meetings, and that was a fantastic event. So everyone would gather at Royal Lodge, and then they'd go off to Cheltenham or off to some of the other meetings. She was pretty obsessed with racing, really. She had had a tannoy system installed, I think at Royal Lodge, certainly at Clarence House, but I think at Royal Lodge as well, so that she could hear all the racing results and the racing commentary as it was going along. So we're talking, long before it was covered on television as widely as it is now.
And she used to invite people back after the races, come and have a cup of tea, but which of course it was always something a bit stronger than that.
There certainly would be, dinners and dancing, and she was very, very free with the alcohol.
The Queen Mother's tipple of choice was a gin and dubonnet, and it said that after 1 you'll need a taxi, after 2 you'll need an ambulance, and after 3 you'll need a priest.
Make it really strong.
I think everyone felt they were very well lubricated if they'd been at one of the Queen Mother's dinner parties. Yes, the wine did flow very, very freely. I think she felt it loosened everyone's tongue probably, but also, their behaviour, because even if you know her quite well, I think you maybe could get quite a little bit stiff in her presence, a bit worried, a bit formal, but she didn't really like that. She liked people to just have a good time.
One of the Queen Mother's partners in making sure the guests always had enough to drink was her footman William Talon, nicknamed Backstairs Billy. He was very influential in the household. And when one of the Queen Mother's guests told another that they were planning not to drink at that lunch, the friend pointed at Talon and said, "That will make no difference, he pours it through the fingers."
When the guests finally got to bed, there was a very handy sort of bottle of Lucozade and some Alka-Seltzer by the bed, which they certainly needed, because it was church the next morning at 11 o'clock.
Whatever the occasion, the grand drawing room was always at the centre of social events at Royal Lodge.
The best picture we have of that room is from the Queen Mother's time, and it gives a picture of tapestries, of big Persian rugs, of furniture of different colours. It looks like the bric-a-brac, the royal also-rans of furniture, but a very comfortable space for that.
The pièce de résistance of the saloon is the decoration at the top, these shields that go all the way around the top of the room, which were found by George VI in a cupboard in Windsor Castle. It's a very elegant, grand room.
Guests arriving to see the Queen Mother would often wait in the octagonal room next door.
It's got, it used to have anyway, a 3-bar electric fire, which is kind of in tune with what her daughter, the Queen, had as well at Balmoral and other places. I always think it's curious to think of a monarch or a very senior royal sitting by a little electric fire, warming their hands, but that's what it was.
It was a real mishmash, I guess, of things, and there was lots of chintz around, like flowers and pots, and the carpet was a bit worn from the dogs running over it.
She liked the worn carpet, she liked the clutter of photographs on the piano, she liked those touches that made this space her home. And I think this was a way of her reliving the happy times that she had shared there when she was a wife and mother.
The Queen Mother also kept the children's nursery full of her daughter's toys.
The Queen Mother's grandchildren and later her great-grandchildren often visited her at Royal Lodge, and she kept a lot of the toys and even the rocking horses that Elizabeth and Margaret had used when they lived at Royal Lodge.
I suppose one of the most valued family heirlooms, if you like, is the Welsh cottage in the gardens of Royal Lodge. I mean, what child wouldn't want to play in that? So that's gone down through the generation.
The children all love it.
So that includes the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren?
And the great-grandchildren.
The Queen Mother also shared her love of gardening with her grandchildren. The fact she didn't use pesticides had a huge influence on Prince Charles in particular.
Sprays and things like that, you don't use them here, do you?
Them, do they?
I think she probably was at the vanguard of the coming organic movement, and certainly her grandson Charles III shared those beliefs.
Royal Lodge's gardens remained a passion for the rest of her long life.
All the way up until the Queen Mother's death, she still had a fascination with the garden. I mean, obviously in the early days, she was more hands-on. She would be there sort of scrubbing out brambles, etc. But later on in life, she was still interested. She would observe, she would ask questions.
She loved to picnic outside in the garden. She loved to have lunch in different rooms in the house. She loved being Queen Mother, but she thought it was a two-way thing and always wanted to communicate joy. And I think the Royal Lodge was a place of laughter and happiness.
But in February 2002, when the Queen Mother was 101 years old, tragedy struck once more with the death of her youngest daughter, Princess Margaret.
When Princess Margaret sadly died, which must have been tragic for the Queen Mother because nobody wants to bury a daughter, bury a child. So she insisted on going to the funeral at Windsor, at St George's Chapel. And then afterwards, she went back to Royal Lodge, and actually she never left Royal Lodge again.
The Queen Mother died at Royal Lodge in March 2002. Her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, was at her side.
Her death was very peaceful, and it was at home, the home she had loved for all those years, her haven, Royal Lodge, and that is incredibly fitting.
Before the scenes of public mourning surrounding her lying in state and her funeral, the Queen Mother's body rested in the Chapel of All Saints at Royal Lodge.
I think although everyone had been expecting her to die because she was almost 102, the family needed a little privacy and a little space and a little time to say their proper farewells to her. And I think that the chapel at Royal Lodge gave them exactly that. They could just be together in this very familiar place, a place that they knew that the Queen Mother had loved so much and that they'd all enjoyed so many happy times.
Royal Lodge now stood empty for the first time in 70 years. Who would be the next occupant of this favourite royal residence? Before the keys to Royal Lodge could be handed to a new resident after the Queen Mother's death, the house needed a major renovation.
The Queen Mother hadn't really spent much money on it, particularly in the sort of 20 years prior to her death. It was very old-fashioned. It needed completely rewiring, replumbing. It needed a new roof, needed completely redecorating.
In 2003, Prince Andrew made a suggestion. He could move into Royal Lodge and take over responsibility for the repairs instead of paying a market-rate annual rent.
Why did Prince Andrew want the lease of Royal Lodge after the Queen Mother's death? I think that it's Prince Andrew. He always wanted the grandest house he could get his hands on.
Prince Andrew's a man who enjoys a status, really, and grandeur, and I think he felt that Royal Lodge was very appropriate, you know, being so close to the castles and so close to the seat of royalty. I think he felt it was in keeping. I mean, it's a lovely house. Who wouldn't want to live there?
Andrew paid £1 million up front and signed a 75-year lease.
He also had to commit to at least £7 million of repairs and keep those repairs up for all the time he had that 75-year lease.
The lease required Andrew to repaint the exterior every 5 years.
2 coats of paint, very specific. And the interior had to be repainted and repapered and decorated every 7 years.
The initial renovations took nearly a year, including removing the 60-year-old outdoor swimming pool and painting Royal Lodge's pink exterior sparkling white. The interiors were freshened up, making Royal Lodge an elegant royal home once more.
It's always filled with fresh flowers. In fact, I think the florist in Windsor literally has a hotline to Royal Lodge, the amount of flowers that get sent there.
And if Prince Andrew's bedroom in Buckingham Palace is anything to go by, there may be a large collection of teddy bears on his bed.
72, I believe, that are arranged in a very specific order every single time.
Woe betide any housemaid who didn't get the exact arrangement of the teddy bears right, which was why there was this plan that had been drawn by one of the senior housemaids and laminated so that every housemaid who made Prince Andrew's bed would know exactly where the teddy bears and soft toys needed to go.
When Prince Andrew moved into Royal Lodge in 2004, his then teenage daughters Beatrice and Eugenie came too.
Beatrice and Eugenie grew up in Royal Lodge, and then as they grew older, there were some rather wild parties there. And one particular incident in 2016, there was a big party, lots of famous people were there.
Amongst whom were James Blunt and Ed Sheeran, and there were some jokes going around that James Blunt should be knighted for services to music and just generally being very posh. And Beatrice got a sword, an ornamental sword that was hanging in one of the corridors, decorating one of the corridors at Royal Lodge.
So Beatrice gets the sword from the wall and she swings it down to knight James Blunt on his shoulder. What she didn't realise was that behind her was the pop star Ed Sheeran, and she caught him on the face with the sword.
And Ed Sheeran, a couple of years later, talked about it on a podcast and said that he didn't really realise, he just thought it was just a scratch, and then suddenly he realised his whole shirt was caked in blood.
So off he has to go to A&E to get stitches. You kind of think, was this party so full of famous people that anywhere you might have moved the sword, you could have bopped a famous pop star on the face?
In 2008, Beatrice and Eugenie's mother, Sarah Ferguson, moved in with her family at Royal Lodge.
She was living on her own in Surrey and they were sharing custody of the girls. And then there was a small fire in her bathroom. And after that, Andrew invited Sarah to go and stay at Royal Lodge.
Sarah's move to Royal Lodge prompted a lot of speculation about their relationship.
I think a lot of people ask the question, are they getting back together?
I don't think either of them would want that. I don't think Sarah would want that for a moment. They've worked it out pretty well, and I admire them for the fact that they have given this solid family home and roots to their girls. It's the best thing.
Sarah says they are the very best of friends, and I think that they are joined in this rather weird royal world where both kind of understand each other and understand the position, and both are in this kind of, mutual support network.
Sarah Ferguson remains Prince Andrew's biggest supporter, his #1 fan, his confidant. She's always got his back. She will defend him to the last.
And Sarah has remained firmly by Prince Andrew's side as his life at Royal Lodge has become tainted by one scandal after the next.
During the time that Andrew has lived at Royal Lodge, his popularity has plummeted.
One of the scandals involving Prince Andrew and his time at Royal Lodge was when he was a trade ambassador. And this involved him, flying off to lots of countries to increase the amount of trade that these countries did with the United Kingdom and work on those relationships. But it seemed that a lot of those foreign trips that he did would go via a ski resort or a golf course.
Andrew became known as Air Miles Andy for travelling as a global ambassador on the public purse in such a luxurious way.
There was a particular incident where a helicopter left from Royal Lodge, flew to a golf course in Kent where Prince Andrew was there for just an hour and flew back again, and that cost the taxpayer £2,000.
It was a lavish, unnecessary expense, and he didn't seem to learn from the bad publicity.
And in 2010, another scandal nearly forced Sarah Ferguson out of Royal Lodge. An undercover newspaper sting caught her promising access to Prince Andrew for £500,000.
And the publicity was so bad, she said as a kind of sacrificial lamb, I'll move out of Royal Lodge. But he said no, he stood by her. And so now she feels very much that she must stand by him.
But these scandals were only the beginning.
Things clearly weren't going well for Andrew in the early 2000s. He was seen as Air Miles Andy, taking taxpayers' money, as boorish, as rude, as extravagant. But you couldn't imagine what would happen, how bad they could get.
Prince Andrew's tenure at Royal Lodge would soon be on a knife edge. In 2017, Royal Lodge was the setting for a pivotal moment in Prince Harry's relationship with Meghan Markle.
Harry and Meghan were on their way to Royal Lodge to meet Princess Eugenie and her boyfriend Jack Brooksbank. They were just going around for tea when they got a call saying that the Queen was there.
Harry says to Meghan, she hadn't met the Queen at this point, so he said, I know she's my grandmother, but you have to address her as Your Majesty and then ma'am. And Meghan was kind of like, what? And then they arrive at Royal Lodge and Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, comes running out and says, do you know how to curtsy? Meghan's like, what? She's like, do you know how to curtsy? You need to curtsy the first time you meet the Queen.
She was gobsmacked. She couldn't believe that you actually had to curtsy to your grandmother.
Despite Meghan's surprise, the unexpected meeting went smoothly.
And after they've left, Meghan Markle asks Harry, she says to Harry, oh, who was that servant that was with the Queen? And Harry says that was Prince Andrew.
The following year, Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson celebrated Eugenie and Jack's wedding with a party at Royal Lodge.
It was certainly a star-studded guest list for Princess Eugenie and Jack Brooksbank's wedding. You had Demi Moore there, you had Naomi Campbell.
There was Kate Moss, her daughter Lila. There was Robbie Williams and his wife Ada Field. Their daughter was a flower girl.
After the main event, they turned the gardens of Royal Lodge into a fairground. I mean, it was a full-size fairground with all sorts of rides and roundabouts. So you had all these Hollywood stars and singers and celebrities and royalty all mixing together and thoroughly enjoying being kids again and going down helter-skelters and on magic roundabouts. I'm sure if the Queen Mother had been able to look down and see the party going on for Eugenie's wedding, she would have given a big thumbs up, actually.
The wedding of Princess Eugenie at Royal Lodge was definitely a high point, but things were about to go downhill from there.
By 2019, Prince Andrew's friendship with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein was dominating the headlines.
The Jeffrey Epstein scandal shocked the world. That this financier who was friends with Prince Andrew was arrested for sex trafficking and found guilty.
Andrew, who has always denied any wrongdoing, gave a now notorious interview to the BBC, believing it would clear his name.
It is a total catastrophe. No expression of sympathy for the victims, no expression of remorse for being friendly with Epstein at all. It was catastrophic on the royal brand. Almost immediately, Andrew was out of the royal fold.
Andrew stepped back as a working royal, losing his reported £250,000 annual income. 3 years later, he settled a sexual assault lawsuit with one of Epstein's victims. He was stripped of his HRH and military titles, and his taxpayer-funded security detail was removed.
Although Prince Andrew till today maintains his innocence, the damage has already been done and there's absolutely no way back for him now.
He's a walking PR disaster for the royal family.
In 2020, there was another family wedding at Royal Lodge, but this was a very different affair from Eugenie's star-filled bash.
Poor Princess Beatrice had this lovely fiancé, Edoardo Mozzi Mapelli. They were going to have a grand wedding, then COVID comes, so where, if you remember, the royal family do get married in COVID times, we've got a private chapel. And it's actually next to where Daddy, the Duke of York, lives, and it's Granny's favourite chapel.
After the ceremony, attended by just 20 friends and family members, there was a low-key reception in the gardens.
It's a very, very small affair. And I know, because Buckingham Palace told me, that they decided not to release a picture of the bride and her father in their own home because of how far Andrew had fallen
Today, Prince Andrew spends much of his time hidden away at Royal Lodge. The house that was so full of life and fun in the Queen Mother's era has become a shadow of its former self. And King Charles seems to think it's time that changed.
Prince Andrew has fallen from grace, and there is a very strong sense that Royal Lodge is far too big, far too grand, and he doesn't deserve to be the custodian of Royal Lodge.
I think it's a really tricky situation, actually, because Andrew has lived in that house for many years. It is his family home. Yes, it's very large, and no, he doesn't need all that space. But he's got a lease on it, you know. He's got a long lease on this house.
If King Charles wants him to leave Royal Lodge, well, he's going to have to just use persuasion, because legally he can't move him out of there. He's rented it from the Crown Estate.
So King Charles has kind of put the squeeze on Andrew, as we understand it, and he said, look, you've got to stump up for your own security.
Until October 2024, King Charles had been paying for Andrew's 8 to 10 person security detail at Royal Lodge. Now, if Andrew wanted to maintain that level of protection, he would need to foot the bill himself.
The whole security issue is very difficult. You could certainly argue that he's not carrying out any royal duties. Why does he need security? I suppose the other side of that argument is that he is a potential target.
Just after Prince Philip's funeral, there was a security breach.
In 2021, an intruder was arrested inside Royal Lodge.
A fan managed to talk her way through security at Royal Lodge and actually got a taxi to drop her off into Royal Lodge.
She said to the guard she had a lunch appointment with Andrew. Could they pay for her taxi? So they let her through.
No one knew who she was or why she was there.
She wandered around Royal Lodge, and then the staff said, "Oh, why are you here?" And at this point she said, "Oh, I'm Andrew's fiancée." But I think had she not said, "I'm Andrew's fiancée, I'm just a friend," she might have been able to carry on wandering round.
As well as making it harder for Andrew to stay at Royal Lodge by cutting his security funding, King Charles has also stopped paying his brother's annual allowance.
Andrew doesn't have much money, and to renovate somewhere like Royal Lodge, even just to pay for the external decoration every 5 years, would probably cost hundreds of thousands.
If he can't keep up the roof and the outside and all the things that a big house needs, he could be in contravention of his lease, and that's the only way he could be thrown out.
King Charles has suggested that Prince Andrew move to the more affordable Frogmore Cottage, closer to Windsor Castle.
Charles is not an unpleasant man, and he's not an uncaring man, and I think he does love his brother and would never just turf him out, which is why we understand he's been offered very, very desirable accommodation. Frogmore Cottage has 5 bedrooms and goodness knows what else, and it's lovely.
Frogmore Cottage used to belong to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It's a really lovely property which has been renovated by Meghan and Harry before they moved to the United States. It is a really beautiful property, definitely smaller than Royal Lodge, but not in a state of disrepair at all.
And Frogmore Cottage wouldn't require additional security expenses for Andrew.
Frogmore Cottage is secure. It's within the current security cordon within what I call sort of the back garden of Windsor Castle. You can't get into it unless you go through one of the 7 gates that gets you into the sort of private home park. You would not need additional security if you were living there.
And it's going to cost him, a tenth of what it costs him to live at Royal Lodge, but that's not how Andrew thinks. He has serious delusions of grandeur, and he thinks that he needs to live in a house like that. It's beautiful, it's lovely, it's his home.
Prince Andrew won't leave Royal Lodge without a fight. He's reportedly found an approved outside source of income and started much-needed repair work on the house.
It is a standoff that I don't see shows any sign of nearing any kind of resolution. I think Andrew will want to remain at Royal Lodge as long as he possibly can.
If Andrew is eventually forced to move out, who might be the next residents of Royal Lodge?
I think if he does move out, it might potentially be rented for a commercial rent, which would bring in more money for the Crown Estate, and then, of course, indirectly, more money to Charles.
I personally think that it would seem to be a very suitable place in the future for the Prince and Princess of Wales. I think that William and Catherine at the moment are very happy where they are, but in the years to come, it would seem to me quite a reasonable proposition that they would want to move into Royal Lodge.
Royal Lodge's future is in many ways tied to its past because of the changes made there in the early 1930s by Bertie and Elizabeth, and then its use as one of the main homes of the Queen Mother for half a century. It is now a place that is associated with senior working members of the royal family. I would anticipate that either it goes back towards a senior working member of the royal family in the next generation, or it may end up being subdivided into smaller residences. So in many ways, Royal Lodge's evolution probably hasn't finished.
Whatever the fate of Royal Lodge, it will remain steeped in memories. In its 200 years as a royal residence, this rural retreat has seen many moments of celebration and laughter, and it has also witnessed some of the family's darkest days. But above all, it's been a place where generations of royals can step away from the spotlight and just be themselves.
Stars above light the way, holding you so close in the night we stay. Soft touch hearts collide.